just set us going live. And hit record. And fantastic. So off we go. Welcome back to another fantastic Spank 21 session. We're getting towards the end of the day now, but that doesn't mean anything about the quality of the sessions, because we've got a few more great sessions coming up before the AGM this evening. Right now we're with Marianna Spring, who is the BBC's specialist disinformation reporter. And if you couldn't guess, the session is about sort of tackling disinformation in the media, which is obviously a very sort of prevalent problem over the last few years and is definitely starting to affect sort of student publications. So we're hoping to give you some of the tools you need to sort of spot the signs of fake news and people trying to hoodwink, well, all journalists, but especially student journalists, and also some of Marianna's experiences as a reporter. So I'm going to hand over to Marianna to sort of chat a bit about her background and her career and how she came to have possibly one of the most unique roles in the BBC. So Marianna.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thank you for having me. I hope my Wi-Fi is being a bit dodgy. Yes, so as Ben explained, I'm the BBC's specialist disinformation and social media reporter, which, contrary to what a lot of the trolls who send me abuse on Twitter think, means that I investigate the impact of online disinformation and conspiracy theories. And I started doing this job a year ago, and since I started, there's been a boom in disinformation on social media about the pandemic in particular, and that's quickly evolved into pretty sinister conspiracy theories, but we've also seen a lot of conspiracy theories and disinformation around elections, and most recently around vaccines. So I spent a lot of time investigating the online anti-vax movement and the impact that it has on people. It is a very unique job, and I think one of the best things about it is that I get to speak to lots of brilliant people, often who have come to harm or had a really difficult time because of online disinformation and conspiracies. And one of my favorite parts of my job is being able to do that, being able to humanize the impact that this has. And I think that's definitely something that I actually learned as a student journalist, how important it is as a reporter to tell a story in an emotive, engaging way. And that's often through a really powerful case study example of something that's happened, and that's what I've tried to do with my reporting. So some of the stories I've done include investigations into the human cost of misinformation, where I interviewed, for instance, a man called Brian who didn't believe COVID was very serious, or that it could be linked to 5G. He and his wife didn't follow health guidance. They didn't seek help sooner when they both fell ill. They were both very unwell with COVID in the ICU in America, and very, very sadly, Erin, Brian's wife, later lost her life due to complications. And telling powerful stories like that is really important to me. Other stories I've done are, for instance, a 21-year-old whose mum has become a conspiracy influencer and promoted a number of false claims about the pandemic, interviewing him and hearing the impact that's had on his personal life, not just on public health more broadly. And there are all kinds of quite bonkers anti-vaccine stories I've covered as well. One of them being how one woman's foot became anti-vaccine propaganda on social media and was used to deliberately further false anti-vaccine narratives because she'd mistakenly claimed that her injury was linked to having the vaccine. And I did an investigation for BBC Panorama that was into the online anti-vaccine movement and the impact that it's having on people throughout the UK, which was inspired by a lovely woman who got in touch with me who's in her 80s, who was scared off the jab because of a video she was seeing. And so I investigated the tactics being used by these activists online, some of which are to deliberately brandish scientific titles or expertise and then go on to promote harmful conspiracy theories. And I think from the point of view more broadly of student journalists, this is a fascinating beat that is one that's becoming increasingly important, particularly because people have been spending so much time on social media, and is one that's certainly relevant to everyone of all ages. In fact, I think there's a misconception that older people are more vulnerable to online disinformation. I often find younger people are just as vulnerable, particularly to conspiracy theories and fake news and disinformation in other forms. And Ben mentioned this, but one of the things that often as a student journalist, you come across stories that you need to verify, you need to look into them. You might have seen something on social media, you don't know whether it's true or not. And there are lots of tools that you can use in order to verify and investigate those things. More broadly, when you're trying to get to the bottom of is this true? Is it not? There are lots of open source investigation tools which are really, really helpful. I use reverse image search a lot. So something called TinEye, which you might have heard of, or Yandex, is a great way of verifying whether a picture or a video is something that did actually happen, or whether an old image is being circulated, or whether an image or video has been manipulated in some way. Also just looking for clues and interrogating and asking questions, which is something that as journalists we do all the time. That's a fundamental aspect of our job. But actually, particularly when you're seeing stuff on social media that's maybe being shared in Facebook groups, on Instagram, on TikTok, just thinking about why someone shared it, what their intention is, how they might be playing on your emotions, and really kind of asking yourself questions about, does this make sense? Would this have happened then? Does the time of the year look right? All of those are things which might seem pretty obvious, but actually are a very good checklist to go through when you're covering any kind of story. And I think that particularly with the rise of anti-lockdown movements, many of which have been infected by online conspiracy theories about vaccines being tools of mass genocide, or COVID being a hoax. And it's worth pointing out that these are extreme conspiracy theories that are worlds apart from legitimate medical debates or political debates that people might be having. But unfortunately, they often exploit or interact with one another, and that can be difficult. But I think that it's something that at different student publications you can all think about covering, and whether it's a post you see in a local Facebook group where your uni is and you want to investigate it and get to the bottom of whether it's true, or interrogating an online movement, trying to understand where it's come from and how it works. I often find local Facebook groups, local WhatsApp groups are hotbeds of viral disinformation, and it can be fascinating to see how those evolve. Similarly, platforms like TikTok are actually increasingly rife with disinformation and conspiracy theories, and so well worth investigating on a student level as well. And yeah, that's my main spiel.
Great. So I've got some questions to kick us off with, but obviously there's quite a lot of people in the audience. So if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask Marianna, or perhaps you've had your own experiences of dealing with disinformation or fake news at your student publication, then please share them. I'm sure we'd all love to hear them. I know that when I was running, I was head of news for my student paper for a couple of years. We'd always get random stuff in the post or from email, from just random, clearly spam. But some of it can look quite convincing. So if people have their own experiences and want to share those would be great. I am actually going to kick off with a question that's in the chat from Brooke, who says, by investigative, what do you mean? So what makes an investigative piece different from a news or enterprise piece in terms of the reporting methodology that you use?
So when it comes to investigative reporting, it's very much, obviously there's the kind of day-to-day news coverage. You can report on events as they happen. So a good example would be this week I was covering the oversight board's ruling on Trump's Facebook account. And so that's providing analysis to something that's already happening, but I'm not revealing anything new. I think revealing something new is effectively the kind of integral part of investigative reporting, often getting to the bottom of something. And when it comes to my job, investigating what's being shared on social media, that means getting to the bottom of how something's being shared, or, figuring something out and then showing that to your audience, and that's crucial. And along with all of that, there's obviously exclusive interviews and other stories like that, which are often in themselves investigative in so much as they expose or reveal something new that people didn't know about. So whether it's the extent of a problem, something really bad that's happened. So I think if you always think of investigative as revelatory, as something that tells you something that you didn't know before, exposes something, maybe expose is the best verb, then that would be the way of doing it. And in terms of the methodology, I think that When it comes to what I do specifically, a lot of it is tracking people down, trying to find the person who originally shared a post and to speak to them and hear their story and understand what's happened. I also use tools like CrowdTangle, which is really, really helpful, and you can sign up to, that allows you to see where a particular post has been shared or how widely. I join Facebook groups. With the story I mentioned about the anti-vaccine, the feet that we use as anti-vaccine propaganda, I added over 100 people called Patricia to find this woman whose feet had gone viral. And it's stuff like that, which I think it doesn't necessarily have to be some huge, hard-hitting investigation, particularly when you're at a student paper, but going through that, trying to figure something out, asking questions and keeping going, not giving up, even when you hit a brick wall, thinking, right, how can I really get to the bottom of this? Because it's never satisfactory or good enough to not be able to answer those questions. So being able to I think the other thing that a lot of my job is exposing people who are deliberately spreading harmful conspiracy theories for different reasons and trying to investigate those motives, whether they want to make money or power or influence. And when I was doing the panorama, that was very much at the heart of the investigation, but also at the heart of those investigations is finding the people who've come to harm, the people who have been affected and impacted, because it's crucial that you understand the scale of the problem and the impact it's having. And I always think one of the reasons my job is so important is because I'm able to expose the harm that online disinformation and conspiracy theories can cause. And there aren't many people dedicated to doing that. And it's important to be able to reveal the scale of this problem. I get hundreds of messages from people whose families have been impacted or come to harm in this way. So yeah, I think revelatory would be key, and it doesn't have to be some huge portfolio, but you do have to be diligent and get to the bottom of stuff.
You'd have thought after 13 months of intensive Zoom training, I'd remember to unmute, but sadly not. Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions, and there's a couple more in the chat and so on. So you've touched on social media and how that's sort of a big sort of driving force behind the growth in disinformation. Why do you think the media have started shining sort of a greater light on disinformation? Through having jobs such as your own, which probably I imagine didn't exist 5 years ago, and things like that, and debunking things that are circulated on social media and saying actually this isn't true. Why do you think they're taking sort of a greater stance on trying to refute and debunk these conspiracy theories?
I think the simple answer is that it's just become way more of a problem as social media has grown, and as we've seen how what's shared on social media impacts the real world, whether it's elections, the pandemic has especially brought to light the harm that can be caused by online conspiracy theories and disinformation and how they can directly affect people's lives. So I definitely think as it's tipped into that causing real world harm, there's been an increased pressure or desire from the media to report on this, to investigate what's going on, to understand it better. My role, it didn't exist until a year ago, and it was created with a view to reporting on the US election. And as we saw on the 6th of January, riots that were partly inspired by online conspiracies took place. So you can see how crucial it is to cover this beat, it's definitely a new and emerging one, not one that, and people often say to me, why do we need to have a specialist disinformation reporter? All journalists' jobs should be to report the truth, and that's absolutely correct. The difference is that my job is specifically to investigate what's being shared on social media, why people are sharing deliberately false things or harmful conspiracy theories, from QAnon to COVID as a hoax or anti-vax propaganda, and the impact that has on people. So I think that's the main reason for the push, really, that tipping over into harm and real world harm. Yeah.
Well, so on sort of a practical level, if you were to give advice to student publications on sort of the things they should be looking out for, in sort of things that they're sent or things they come across on social media, especially like you said, where all student journalists who are doing an academic course end up in local area Facebook groups where these things can spread quite easily. What are sort of the hallmark signs to look out for, and how can you protect yourself to ensure that you're not falling foul of of people spreading disinformation?
There are a number of things that you can do. I think first and foremost is just to interrogate absolutely everything you see, whether it's something that's sent to you by email, whether it's something that you see on social media. Think about why the person shared it and why they shared it with you. Actually, some of the best advice I've had is from a producer I worked with at Panorama, who has a phrase which is, every time you see something anywhere, this is from a journalistic point of view, every time that you see a post or you get sent something or someone gets in touch with you, ask yourself 2 questions. How do we know it and why do we think it's true? Because that how question means, have they got another motive for wanting to send this to you? Is there a reason they want you to cover it? And obviously you also need to be absolutely sure that it's correct, that it's true, that it's accurate before you report on it. And I think that can be applied really, really broadly. I think when it comes to particularly Facebook groups and stuff you're seeing on Twitter or TikTok or Instagram, what's crucial is one of the key hallmarks of disinformation on social media is stuff that's emotive. It makes you angry, it makes you upset. People are often excited about stuff. I don't know if people remember the story about Woolworths that went really viral, where a 17-year-old, as part of a media project, created a fake Woolworths Twitter account and pretended that Woolworths was opening again, just to see how much that brand resonated with everyone. And everyone lost it. They were so excited, so much so that they didn't even think to question whether it was true. Actually, the handle had spelled Woolworths wrong. So whenever anything makes you feel strongly is absolutely a time that you should pause to think. And also if it's a post that's making other people feel strongly. We've often found this during the pandemic. I think particularly with regards to students, there'll be images of people kind of breaking COVID rules or allegations of stuff like that. And when it's super, super emotive, just stop for a second and check that it's true, or how can you verify it's true? Get in contact with the person who shared the post originally, or perhaps people who featured in it, or people who've shared it. Make sure to ask all the right questions, and it's always better to ask too many questions. I think that there are also tools that you can use when you're, as I said, when you're trying to verify stuff. So reverse image search, like I mentioned, that's TinEye and Yandex and stuff like that. CrowdTangle is really good for working out where a post originated from and why it's being shared. I think those are the kind of 2 main tools that I turn to when I'm verifying stuff on social media and trying to figure out. Another thing that's really good is just using Google Maps. If something's kind of alleged to happen somewhere and you think, I don't think the weather looks quite right, or I can't work it out, go on Google Maps, find the location, see if the 2 match up, or see whether the picture's been doctored in some way and doesn't actually match with what you'd expect. And all of those things are really good ways to protect yourself, because the more that you're aware of this and understand it, the less likely you are personally to fall victim to it. And I think just the key is interrogating and asking questions and verifying. And if you're not sure, keep going until you are sure that you're right. Or maybe you can never know, but accept, well, I don't know why someone shared this.
Yeah. Great. I'm going to go to a couple of the questions that have been sent in. So apologies if I get this name wrong, but Isidore asks that why do you think people believe news that's not from official news stories, from the official news sources? Because everyone knows that lies exist. Obviously, people are falling for these stories regularly. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a growth of them. So, why do you think some people are so prone to believe in them?
I think that actually there's a misconception that people who believe this kind of stuff are very gullible, that they're not being critical enough of what they're seeing online. And while the latter might be true, I actually think being gullible is not the main trait that I see from people who believe and fall foul of this stuff. Rather, it's people that are often very distrustful, so they don't trust the mainstream media, they don't trust authority and institutions, often for very legitimate reasons, because of bad experiences they've had or because of their own lives. But as a consequence, it leaves them very, very vulnerable to being exploited by people, often with very bad intentions, who want to spread fake news. I think we often talk about disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is deliberately trying to spread false or fake news, false claims, myths online. And those are the kinds of people that are deliberately exploiting often that distrust or often just over-engagement with social media, which I think is another reason why young people use different sources to get their news, and they rely and trust on different things. And I think that is crucial to this. When it comes to misinformation, I think that's often driven by fear. We saw at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people were really worried about lockdown and what it meant, and COVID and what it meant. And we saw on WhatsApp loads of images of tanks and soldiers on the streets going mega viral. I was sent loads and loads of them. And I think that shows you, and that was from people who generally do trust the news and read, the BBC or various other news outlets, and they were convinced that there were tanks on the streets, or they just weren't sure whether there might be, and it just made them feel frightened. And I think that the emotive response that often these posts inspire is part of the reason why people then believe them or share them. Even if they don't fully believe them, they often reshare them just to ask other people, and that can be part of the problem. Or because they want to help other people, they think, oh, well, just in case it's true, I'll share it. But actually sharing something just in case can often be really harmful. So I think those are the two main reasons, really. Distrust is the main factor when it comes to people believing kind of systematic fake news and disinformation. And I think that fear and emotions mostly explain why people accidentally share stuff. I mean, one example myself, I remember sharing this meme that was of, I think maybe a wombat, I can't remember the animal, that was helping lots of baby animals into their, I don't know what a wombat's home is called, a wombat warren, and and it was like it said something like, oh look, this wombat's doing a better job of looking after the baby animals than the Australian government are of looking after the Australian people. And I sort of should have questioned why it had kind of such a political caption, and that in itself was the red flag that this wasn't true. But at the time I thought it was true, and the picture was really cute, so I'd sent it round like, oh, this is such a cute wombat, and then soon realized that I had inadvertently spread fake news because that had never happened, and it was an old picture from a different time. But it shows you, it's not like people are stupid. All of us can fall foul to this stuff. The problem is when people are repeatedly falling foul to it, and that's usually because they just don't trust the mainstream media for various reasons.
Yeah. What's the motivation behind people who are trying to spread this fake news? Is it just a political agenda, or is there like a financial aspect to it as well? The opportunity to make money out of people sharing these things. Is that part of it as well?
Yes, definitely. The main drivers of people spreading disinformation on social media in particular are gaining influence and gaining power. We all know that if you post divisive things online now, you can often build quite a substantial following, and that in itself is useful, whether it's to sell or promote something, everything from books to consultations, which we see happening quite a lot, particularly in the pseudoscience community, but also just to grow your influence as a sort of celebrity. Really, there are these pseudoscience influencers who have absolutely become, minor celebs in their own bubbles and circles, and that's a little bit more complex, perhaps is more of an ego thing. And then you've also got people that are doing it for political gain, whether it's a political disinformation campaign or they're looking to kind of influence or change an outcome for themselves. We see that happening a lot as well. So those are the kind of broadly main motivations. There are some genuine believers, but I think when you look at the sort of the way that this works, there are a very small minority of very committed activists who deliberately do this stuff for bad. And then there are the people that fall victim to them that themselves go on to spread this stuff, but they actually genuinely often believe what they're being told. And then there's sort of the rest of us. And that's how it works.
Yeah, great. I'm going to go to David next, who has his hand up. So let me just ask him to unmute, and David should be able to ask his question.
No worries. Let me put my hand down, really. Thank you very much for this talk. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to us, Marianna. I really appreciate it. My question I wanted to ask you really is something that I sort of just thought about just now whilst listening to a podcast one time. It was between like the podcast host and a journalist that used to work for the BBC and ITV. And they mentioned about people getting themselves in a rabbit hole in terms of, information that they try to seek the truth on social media and all that kind of stuff. Do you feel like, so the first question I wanted to ask is, do you feel like the pandemic has sort of unraveled the sort of mistrust and that there already is towards the media? And do you feel like we are going to get in at a stage where there is a rabbit hole of us trying to continuously seek the truth whether it's true or false or whatever.
Thanks so much. And that was a very good question. Yes, so in answer to your first question, I think absolutely, it's quite interesting really, because when the pandemic first happened, everyone was really relying on, more people were watching and consuming the BBC than ever before. Everyone was kind of turning to the news more than they usually would, because it was affecting their lives so much. And in some ways you'd think, oh, well, surely it would increase trust in the media because people are using this stuff more and they're relying on it more. But actually, I think particularly the kind of spiraling of online conspiracy theories, which very much has gone hand in hand with this big world event happening that we're all trying to make sense of. In some ways, that distrust has deepened because people have universally not enjoyed the past year. They haven't liked lockdowns. They haven't liked all of this stuff. And the media's telling you this information that you don't necessarily want to hear. And I think that's contributed to this a lot. I think absolutely it's kind of deepened the cracks of distrust that were very much there, particularly because bad actors have deliberately exploited that and used the mainstream media or the BBC as a way of bolstering their own influence and encouraging people to follow them and trust them and distrust media outlets, which, as someone who works for the BBC, I mean, my experience has always been of brilliant reporters, journalists, everyone who dedicates so much time and effort to explain themselves. So sometimes it's quite hard to understand. And I think with regards to your second question, absolutely, I think that because people have been looking for answers and looking for information and spending a lot of time on social media more than they ever would before, they have certainly found themselves going deeper and deeper into this online rabbit hole, because there's so much available to you. Some of it is bad, some of it is good, some of it's helpful, some of it's not. And particularly when you're looking for answers to questions, you want to know when this will all end, you want to understand how it works. It's very, very easy. And you're also feeling probably a bit anxious, a bit frightened, more vulnerable to this kind of stuff. And you might be distrustful of authority or media because you don't like the way the government's handled the pandemic, or you feel as though a news outlet has covered something in an unfair way. And as a consequence, you reject it entirely and turn your attention to something else. And I think what I always find when I'm talking to people is this will begin with them just being critical of government, which is totally legitimate, or engaging in legitimate medical debates about blood clots and vaccines. But then very quickly, when they're exposed to more stuff on social media, they start to fall into much more extreme conspiracy theories. So suddenly they think Bill Gates is trying to kill everyone or microchip everyone with a vaccine. And that feels very, very different to saying, oh, I don't like the way that the government have handled the pandemic, but all of a sudden you're there. And that tells you a lot about how quickly what's being shared on social media can impact you and exploit what you think. So I definitely think something that I'm investigating sort of for the coming months really, and something that I think will be really fascinating, is what happens to particularly a lot of the people who've fallen deep into this conspiracy rabbit hole. Where do they go? Do they start believing other conspiracy theories, climate change denialism? Are they really vulnerable to far right groups or other extremist groups? Or do they just sort of relax a little bit because the pandemic is over? I don't think it will be that. So yeah, it's something that I'm looking into, particularly for the families that have had relationships ruined and a really difficult time because people are now believing really extreme conspiracy theories that are totally at odds with the rest of the family and actually kind of causing them harm and other people harm. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, David. Great question. There's another couple in the chat, and please keep them coming either in the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask Marianna directly. So Mayola says, what verification tools do you use to tackle disinformation? Obviously, you mentioned a couple, like the ones with photo verification and stuff like that. But are there any that you sort of haven't touched on yet that are quite crucial to your work sort of day to day?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think there's this misconception, I guess, that when you're covering disinformation and social media that you have all these kind of like whizzy tools in your back pocket, when actually a lot of it is just reporting, but doing that in a social media online setting. So it's, messaging lots of people. That's actually the best tool ever, is being able to send people Facebook messages or DMs on Instagram or Twitter and to get to the bottom of something they've shared or understand what they're doing. And that is absolutely the most helpful. Similarly, joining Facebook groups and being able to ask people questions and message them, those things are really, really useful as well. Like I said, yeah, reverse image search and CrowdTangle. There's another tool that people can use called Spreadfast as well, and both CrowdTangle and Spreadfast are great for being able to track specific posts. You can see where something's been shared online. You can see how much it's been shared, how many times, how much traction it's got, and that can be really, really helpful in general. The most interesting thing I find when you're trying to verify a video or anything else is just spotting those clues. When there were various protests in the US following the murder of George Floyd, we saw lots of videos that were showing bricks allegedly on street corners, and there were claims that the bricks were being kind of used to the bricks were trying to bait protesters and get them to be violent, or that they were being planted in some way. And just going on Google Maps and often finding the street corner and realizing that those bricks had actually been there for the best part of a year because there was building work going on was one of the best ways of verifying stuff. So I definitely think, you know, using those simple tools is actually just as effective. You don't need to be kind of subscribing to all this really snazzy stuff, just messaging people and asking good questions and thinking, oh, this is a bit weird. They say that this was filmed in Scunthorpe in December, but it looks like it's about 40 degrees. And you probably think it's not true.
So I'm going to go to, well, Lauren's question in the chat, and then I'll come to Darcy, who's got her hand up. So Lauren's is quite a long one. Something I've noticed on social media is sometimes in response to journalism that counters disinformation is people pushing back against the facts an article presents, saying that news outlets are being paid by the government or other sources to push a particular agenda, and that fact-checking articles are biased or untrue, and so on. How do you think we can tackle that kind of pushback and attempts to undermine the work? And I suppose that's a question related to sort of trust in the media and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And in some ways, it's why my job exists, because fact checking is brilliant. It's really helpful. But it very much appeals to kind of the broad section of people in the middle who just want answers and are kind of going to believe those fact checks. It gets into much more thorny territory when you're dealing with people who do not believe those fact checks. Like you say, they believe that you're being paid or controlled by someone else, that this is actually all part of the plot in itself. And some of the best advice I've had about reporting on this and also interviewing people who believe things like that is from people who often have experienced firsthand relatives or loved ones falling kind of deep into these online conspiracies. And they recommend questioning, saying, okay, great, well, how would that work? How would this mass plot be possible? You know, why would I be doing this? I don't really understand. You know, if there was this huge conspiracy going on and we were all being paid by the government and it was all part of the plan, why is there no whistleblowers? There was a brilliant woman I interviewed who has rejected online conspiracy theories and anti-vaccine beliefs that she'd held previously from stuff she'd seen on social media. And she always asks that, you know, why are there no whistleblowers? There's no way that tens of thousands of people, there wouldn't be one person who sells their story or speaks to someone or does something. So I often think questioning in that way can be really helpful. Another line of questioning that often is really good is to kind of ask things like, do you think the government are competent? Which often people will respond, no, I don't think the government are competent. And then you'll say, well, right, how have they orchestrated this mass genocide? I don't understand. And so I think interrogating in that way is really helpful. I also think by reporting on the impact of online disinformation, you kind of solve two problems. One, you don't glorify the people who spread this stuff or give them too much of a platform. But also you are able to humanize the impact this has, and in many ways weaponize what allows conspiracy theories and disinformation to be so effective. And when people can see a real person who's been impacted, I think they're less likely to come back at you with a lot of those responses. They will nonetheless, but I think that broadly people switch off a little bit from fact checks or are more likely to say, oh, I don't really know. Whereas when they can see someone who has legitimately been harmed or had a really difficult time because of online conspiracies, I think they're more likely to kind of pause for thought. But yeah, I think the crucial thing there is just is questioning and interrogating and knowing when it's worth questioning. And I always try and report on this from a point of empathy and engage with people and understand what they think. But there are some people whose minds you will not change. And in many ways, you know, I'm not a campaigner. My job isn't to change anyone's mind. My job is to report on this topic. And I think you can engage with them and ask, you know, why do you think this? I don't understand. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to, you know, it's going to be changed at all. I think more broadly, the best way of combating that as an industry is for, you know, really powerful investigative reporting, accurate reporting, restoring people's faith and confidence, reporting on stories that appeal to different people from different demographics, from different places. I think all of that, when people feel kind of that the media is more inclusive and that it's doing really really good and important coverage, then they are more likely to kind of trust and rely on it. And I think being transparent in our workings as well, so showing people, which I often try and do in my reporting, you know, how I went about investigating something or figuring something out. If you bring the audience with you, then you're showing them what you do. And I think that transparency is key. It's why people love the sort of open source investigations so much, I think, because they get to come along with you and understand it better.
Great. We've still got just over 10 minutes left before we need to start wrapping up to head to the last session of the day. So please keep your questions coming in. There's a couple of people with hands up. So first up, Darcy, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, Marianna. It's great to meet you. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us today. As someone who has family members that have fallen down the rabbit hole, I really appreciate that the work that you're doing. I think it's so important, not just coming from a student journalist background, but just as a person in society. So thank you. Something I wanted to ask you was that how do you deal with the backlash and online hate from people who have fallen victim to disinformation and online conspiracy theories? I do follow you on Twitter, and I have seen the abhorrent things that people have been saying. And I just, you know, would love to know how you deal with it, because I think that it must take an enormous amount of courage to wake up every day and go to work with that streaming in almost constantly.
Thank you so much, Darcy, and that's very kind of you, and really nice to say. And I'm really happy that you found my reporting helpful. I think in some ways that almost answers a little bit of your question, which is because this feels so important, and because I love doing my job, and because I think that it's overall something that is a very good, positive thing. In many ways, that outweighs the horrible stuff that I get from people who believe online conspiracies and don't like me as a consequence. And being able to tell the stories of the different people I've interviewed who've been harmed by online disinformation, it to me feels so much more important than, you know, the horrible messages I get. And so I think that's the main driver. I think in a more practical sense, and it's something as well, I think, that is really useful as student journalists to kind of equip yourselves with, because everything is, I mean, when I edited my student paper, we were using social media a fair bit, but not too much. You didn't build a kind of social media profile in quite the same way. And that was only a few years ago. So I think that being, you know, knowing how you can protect yourself, because even if you're not covering disinformation or online conspiracies, and that is a very kind of unique and committed bunch of people who send me abuse, you can be exposed to this stuff. And so I think there are obviously tools on the social media sites. I'll often mute people, or actually I'll often block people if they are repeatedly harassed, kind of sharing things, encouraging their followers, which is often how the kind of trolling ecosystem works. I think having a great team around you, and I think as student journalists, you know, just all talking about it. If someone receives a horrible message or something's not very nice, you know, it's not normal, and it should never be seen as normal to receive that kind of stuff. And you should be able to talk about it and kind of support one another and understand what someone might be experiencing. And that's what I find really helpful. I have a brilliant editor who has reported lots on the far right and conspiracy theories and has a really good understanding of receiving abuse in this way. And at the BBC, there are brilliant teams of security advisors and editors and everyone else. I think when people really support you and have your back, it makes receiving abuse feel a little bit easier. I think the other thing that I'm quite fortunate in some ways to be able to do is that because my remit is investigating social media, I actually do report on online abuse, and I'm able to, you know, investigate the topic. I'm currently working on a big investigation about the impact of online abuse and our approach to it and the way that society discusses it, and that kind of don't feed the trolls mantra. Is it right? Is it wrong? And I find that really empowering to be able to highlight it, to be able to talk about it in a way that a lot of my colleagues can't necessarily, maybe because of their specific roles. There are a lot of on-air correspondents at the BBC who receive horrific abuse, from misogynistic abuse to racist abuse to homophobic abuse, and it's really horrific. So yeah, I think that the most crucial thing, I'm worried that my internet might have cut out. I hope it hasn't. Did my internet go there?
We can still hear you. Yeah, there you go.
Good. I suddenly saw Darcy freeze, and I was like, sorry, I'll say what I was saying before. It was just that a lot of on-air correspondents at the BBC receive, horrific abuse, and abuse that I'm very fortunate not to experience, from racist abuse to homophobic abuse, and then also misogynistic abuse, which is part of what I experience. And they can't talk about it in the same way. Perhaps they don't want to, or perhaps just because of their roles. But I personally find it really helpful. And I do often think, when I talk to my friends who are not journalists and who are not reporters, and I highlight this kind of stuff, and they'll be like, God, that's awful. That shouldn't be happening. Whereas often in the media industry, people can become a little bit desensitized to it. And I think it's crucial to keep highlighting it and to show people that it's really not normal and that it's a problem. And I think as well, how that kind of fits into being an impartial journalist, in my case at the BBC, is, being like, trolling is wrong and horrible, and stuff that causes harm to people is wrong and horrible, and you don't have to sort of be neutral on that. So yeah. But thank you for your question.
Great. We've also got a hand up from Chris, who is actually, he's just put his hand down. I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure if Chris does want to ask this question. We'll move on. So, do you think that, obviously the BBC is the first sort of major organisation to have a specialist disinformation reporter? Do you think it's something that we'll start to see other organisations start to adopt, especially as your work has been quite successful, I'd say, over the last year? It's a prime year for it, really, with the amount of disinformation flowing around about COVID. Do you think more organisations will start to branch into trying to have your beat as well?
Yeah. So I guess the UK is quite behind the US in this sense. So in the US, there are lots of really brilliant reporters, correspondents who cover this beat specifically. People like Jane Litvinenko at BuzzFeed, or Craig Silverman, who's just left BuzzFeed. Brandy and Ben, who are this great duo who do stuff at NBC. So I think that it's, particularly after the 2016 election in the US, it's a beat that grew massively. And I think we're going to see the same thing happen in the UK. I think social media investigations more broadly absolutely is something that I think all news organisations do in the UK at the moment. But I think specifically correspondents and reporters who are dedicated to investigating online disinformation and conspiracy theories will definitely be a thing. We've seen the rise in, fact-checking arms of different news outlets, whether that's Channel 4 has one, BBC has Reality Check, and I work a lot. I collaborate a lot with those teams as well. Reality Check at the BBC. But yeah, I absolutely think that having reporters who are dedicated to investigating this stuff and not just fact checking, but exposing the harm, interviewing the people affected, will become more of a thing. And people often say to me, "Oh, well, hopefully when COVID's done, I think when COVID's done is a sort of defunct sentence, but anyway, I shouldn't even say that. I need to touch wood. But when hopefully when this life gets a bit more normal, maybe this won't be a problem anymore." And actually, I think that it's something that's very integral to the way our society functions at the moment, that social media is interwoven with all of our lives, and as a consequence, what's being shared on it can have a really negative impact in lots of different ways. But I think specifically, big online movements, conspiracy theories, disinformation will continue to affect us, whether it's, in the immediate aftermath of a big news event where people don't know what's going on, which we see happen quite a lot, or these kind of more sinister online conspiracy movements. And we're actually seeing a lot of political platforms being built on these kinds of movements. So I think that it will continue to be a big issue going forward. So I hope that lots of other places will be covering it. And I think as student journalists in particular, one of the best bits of career advice that I was ever given was that it's really good to specialize and then generalize, to have something that you can do that is your kind of niche, and then broaden that out if you want to. And so, I absolutely love doing my job, and being able to, really understand this beat and to report on it and investigate and get to grips with it has been so crucial. And I think finding something that you can really sort of double down on and really invest in is really good. And often if it's something, I don't know, that even just a particular area within an area, whether it's a certain area of politics or something else you're interested in, and really investigating it and going hard on it is a very good way of building up a portfolio of reporting, particularly. Great.
It turns out that Chris did have a question, and apparently was waving frantically, but I couldn't see him on my screen. I think everyone else except me might have seen that. So I'm going to go back to Chris now to get his question.
Oh, thank goodness I could unmute as well. I think I was just frantically waving earlier, embarrassingly. But hi, Marianna. I just wanted to say, brilliant work. And I suppose the question that I had is that as journalists, we're told time and again to check, and then check some more. And my question is more about kind of like people's behaviors, which I think has led to such a prominent role as well, though, is that get things on WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, etc., and just take it as kind of like given that that's actual fact. Why do you think in terms of people's behavior that they do that and kind of like almost blindly think, right, that's got to be true? Someone's told me that Bill Gates is going to inject a microchip, and all of a sudden I'm going to have an update of Windows 10 on my bicep or something like that. So I suppose it's a twofold question. One, why are people's behaviors kind of like that? And then second, if you had a simple way of explaining how to do those checks, what would they be for people?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you, Chris. I think that when it comes to why people are so quick to believe this stuff, I think, again, sort of comes back to that question of trust and distrust. And if people get something from someone they know, whether it's like a family member, a friend, on WhatsApp, they're just much more inclined to trust them. And we see that also with local Facebook groups, local WhatsApp groups. When it's someone down the road from you, you feel much more inclined to trust them than some random person on the other side of the world who's talking to you in a YouTube video. And so I think it's for that reason that groups in particular, and especially those that are local or those with friends and family, can be really fertile places for disinformation to spread. And we definitely saw that at the beginning of the pandemic, and continue to see that you're just much more likely to think, oh, why is Joe down the road telling me that there's a tank outside? There must be. I think that's the main reason, really. And that also just how reliant we are on social media, that people, spend much more time on WhatsApp probably than they do on any news site most of the time. And so how easy and quick it is to be sent this stuff and access it, and how easy and quick it is to broadcast it to everyone else. And I think that's one of the things that makes a big difference. Like, lies and fake news are in many ways something that have happened throughout history, but the ability to broadcast them to so many people or to share them so quickly is what makes this a big problem. So I think definitely kind of, again, down to trust and distrust and who you believe and don't believe, and which is why I often encourage people, if they, and a lot of experts have sort of told me this when I've interviewed them, that if someone has fallen victim to conspiracy theories or is believing them, you are actually probably the best vessel to talk to them about it, because they're much more likely to trust you than they are, me, who they think is like a psyop, spy, whatever else I am. And then, on your second question, I think that my kind of headline tips would always be, how does it make you feel? If it makes you feel strongly, definitely pause and think before you share, and interrogate the source. Why have they shared it? What's the intention? What's the motive? Who are they? Get to the bottom of who shared it originally. And I think if you follow those golden rules, you generally won't be slipped up by stuff that you're seeing either in your personal life or as a journalist.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marianna.
Thank you.
Fantastic. We're more or less out of time, so I'll just ask one last question, and then we'll start to wrap up. Quickly, what is the most rewarding story that you think you've done sort of in your role at the BBC?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think probably it was when I was doing the panorama, and Rosemary, who is the woman in her 80s who was scared off the jab by this anti-vaccine video that she was sent on WhatsApp, actually by her daughter, which speaks to Chris's point that she was much more likely to believe it because someone she knew shared it with her. Just being able to investigate that video, investigate the tactics, kind of expose why these conspiracy theories were not true and how these tactics were affecting Rosemary, and then to go with her and her lovely husband Donald and see them have their vaccine was one of the best things. It was so nice, and they were so lovely. And they still often WhatsApp me. And so I think those kinds of stories, but particularly that one, just because I was able to see the kind of possible danger and then the brilliant outcome at the end.
Fantastic. So that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thanks so much to Marianna for coming along and sharing some really important knowledge with us, and to all the audience for coming and asking questions. The next hour is our final sort of Spank 21 sessions of the day. So we've got a Pitching for Beginners workshop with a whole host of people, including Jack Summers, Beth Ashley, I'm going to butcher this, but Duva Balram, who is the editor of Each Other, and Jem Collins, who of course runs Journal Resources, in room 1, as well as an in conversation session with Terry Schultz in room 2. And then, of course, after that, the SPA annual general meeting kicks off, where we'll be hearing from all the executive committee about what we've been up to this year, as well as electing a new committee and a trustee, and voting on some motions. So hopefully we'll see you at a session at 5, and in our annual general meeting at 6:30. Thanks so much to everyone for coming, and we will see you in a few minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And for all the nice messages on the chat. Bye. Thanks.